Good morning, folks. Good morning. Oh, Lord. I wish I had that much energy.
Oh, yes.
A lot of folks, most of the Christians I know, don't really understand the connection between the church and the Old Testament. They don't understand how it's connected. They just think the Old Testament's a bunch of pretty interesting stories, but they don't really have anything to do with us. And they think that Israel is a forsaken and forgotten people. But the New Testament writers say it a little different. They based all their teachings on a good, clear understanding of the Old Testament. And when I was putting this together, I got a surprise. It's back here near the last page. I'll get to it in a minute. Hebrews chapters 3 through 5 kind of lays out all the connections between the Old Testament, Israel, and the church. Think about it for a minute. Israel wandered around through the desert for 40 years in search of the promised land. The church, us as individuals, wander through the wilderness of this world in search of our eternal promised land. All right. Moses was raised up by God to lead Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Jesus was raised up by God, the new Moses, to lead us out of the spiritual slavery to sin. Let me read Hebrews 3 verse 5. And Moses verily was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm unto the end. Let me read you a little story about something that happened to the Israelites, and it's all tied together. It's in Exodus 32 verses 1 through 6. When the Israelites had all kind of miracles, miraculous rescues and deliveries, they finally ended up at the mountain of God, and Moses went up to talk to God to get the law. And while he was gone, something happened. Exodus 32 verse 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them to me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. Excuse me. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool. After he had made it a molten calf, and they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation, and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow, and offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. The children of Israel had been in bondage in Egypt over 200 years. And then God called up Moses, the deliverer, and told him in Exodus 3, verses 6 through 8, that he had heard their cries and was just about to deliver them out of Egypt. Exodus 3 verse 6. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. That's awful similar to what we hear every Sunday in church. This God is going to come down and deliver us out of the slavery to sin. Okay, anyway. Now, during their time in Egypt, the Israelites had started to doubt the existence of the God their fathers had worshipped, because Moses, he asked God to give him the answer to some of the hard questions he's going to get. In Exodus 3:13, and Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What's his name? What shall I say to them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me to you. Now, to help Moses prove that this God was real, God gave him a bunch of miraculous signs to help the Israelites believe. His stick would come to life and turn into a serpent, and there's several other little old things. But the ones that I think have the most to do with us are the 10 plagues. When Egypt first, Joseph, I'll put it that way, when Joseph got sold into slavery to the Egyptians, this is at the end of the book of Genesis, it ended up that God intended that to happen, and the Israelites ended up finding plenty to eat and a place to stay in the middle of a famine. And Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, had actually rose to be second in command in Egypt. Now Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and he even forgave his brothers that sold him into slavery, and asked them to relocate their father and all the Israelites to Egypt so he could take care of them. And that's, as Genesis comes to a close, everything is just hunky-dory with Egypt. It's just, everything's lovely. Then a few generations passed. And a few generations, that Egyptian Pharaoh realized there's too many Jews in Egypt, and he started considering them a threat. Now, at the opening of Exodus, there's a bunch of generations that lived and died, and they grew to such a huge number that the Pharaoh decided to enslave them so they could work on all these building projects he was coming up with. And now they're suffering under Pharaoh. But God hears their prayer, and Moses is born. Y'all know the story about little Moses in the bulrushes and all that stuff. I'm going to skip over that a little bit and get to the part where God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him that God says to let my people go. He was about 80 years old at this time, and he had a history with Pharaoh. Pharaoh's daughter had adopted Moses, and he was actually part of the royal family. And then he killed an Egyptian that had said something about the Jews. That's a long story anyway. he had a history with Pharaoh, and he was afraid to go back there. Now, when he was about 80 years old, and all the folks that wanted to kill him was done dead, God told him to go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. He said, well, I can't talk good. It kind of made God a little upset with him, but he said, okay, take your brother Aaron, let him be your voice for you. Now Pharaoh, like I said, he's right in the middle of a big bunch of building projects. And he didn't want to turn his workers loose. So, in a bunch of back and forth between Moses and Pharaoh, Moses urges the old Pharaoh to give in and let him go, and when he don't, God sends these plagues against him. Now, I know y'all know them by heart, but I'm going to go through them real quick. And this whole thing I'm talking about has to do with us because it's a I don't want to get ahead of myself, but this is a picture of what happens to Christians. This is what Christians endure. The first plague is described in Exodus, near the end of Exodus chapter 7. And here, God tells Moses to take his stick and hit the Nile River with it. And it turns to blood, killing all the fish, making the land stink worse than it already does. And then Aaron stretches his staff out over all the other bodies of water, and they all turn to blood. Even the water that the people had gathered up and had in jars. God's real thorough when he's making a point, okay? Next, God sends a plague of frogs to cover the land, and follows that with a plague of gnats and lice and then flies. And that's in Exodus 8 and 9. And then God sends a plague that kills all the cattle of the Egyptians, but he don't touch the Israelites' cattle. And in Exodus 9, he sends boils to the Egyptians. And there's a rain of hail mixed with fire that fell on the Egyptians, but not in the land that Israel inhabited, Goshen. Now Pharaoh, he's still resisting God's command. So in Exodus 10, God sends a plague of locusts to eat up whatever the hail didn't kill. And that was followed by 3 days of darkness so thick that none of the Egyptians moved for 3 days, but there's plenty of light in the land of Goshen. The final plague in Exodus 11 and 12 was the death of every firstborn child in Egypt. By the way, the Jews still remember that to this day. They celebrate that, or they commemorate that with the Passover. Every Israelite house sacrificed a lamb. By the way, there's a story behind that too. Sacrificed a lamb, an Egyptian lamb, and put the blood of the lamb on the 2 doorposts and the lintels of their house, so the Lord would pass over that house and not kill everybody in it. At this final, it was terrible plague, Pharaoh finally gave in, and Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to freedom. They made their exodus from slavery. When you think about it for just a minute, that last plague was a pretty doggone picture of Jesus as the Passover lamb, sacrificed for the sins of the world. And then after that, Jesus rose from the dead, becoming the firstborn of the dead. I know about Lazarus and I know about Enoch and all that, but anyway, this is the firstborn of the dead. Revelation 1 verse 5, and from Christ Jesus, who is the faithful witness, and the first begotten of the dead, and the prince of the kings of the earth, unto him that loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood. And then over in Colossians 1:18, and he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. So when you hear folks arguing that Jesus, that's not the first fellow to come back to life. Yeah, it was. Why did God pick those 10 plagues? I was a little surprised at some of this. Of course, the obvious answer is he wanted to get the undivided attention of the Egyptians. And he wanted to show the Egyptians that their gods were totally powerless against the one true God. And he wanted to show the Israelites who had forgot that I am really exists and really is the one true God. And he wanted to humble Pharaoh and show him who's really in charge. Of course, he wanted to free the Israelites from slavery and oppression too. Well, now here's the list of the 10 plagues again, and the Egyptian god that they humiliated. The Nile turns to blood. The Egyptian god Hapi was pictured as a water bearer and was known as the god that protects the Nile River. Humiliated her. Okay, frogs. They had a goddess called Hecate that was the goddess of fruitfulness and fertility. She was a frog. Okay, bugs. I never knew anybody worshiped gnats and lice. The Egyptians did. They called that Geb, G-E-B. Geb was the god of the dust of the earth. Kepher was the god of bugs. And, excuse me, when Aaron waved his staff over the dust of the earth, there come up a plague of gnats and lice. They got a big dose of their god, Geb and Kepher. After that, we know who the God of creation is. The Egyptians believed that a fly was the God of creation. They called it Khepri. They called Khepri, the God of creation, was pictured as having the body of a fly. Okay, diseased cattle. Ammon and Hathor were cow gods of love and protections. They were pictured as a cow or a bull. Isis, y'all heard of Isis and Osiris and all that junk. Isis was the goddess of medicine, and Sekhmet was the goddess of healing. So God sent boils that their medicine and their doctors couldn't cure. Now comes the one, I'm going to get some scientific explanations for some of these. Some of them are pretty interesting. Hail mingled with fire. I never heard of nothing like that before. But there's something that happened about 800 miles away. Anyway, it's a long story. Hail mingled, I'll tell you, I get over that when I get to this scientific stuff. Nut, N-U-T, Nut, the goddess of the sky, is what inspired God to send hail and fire from above to destroy their crops. I'm about done, but 3 more. Serapia was the goddess that protected Egypt from locusts. God sent swarms of locusts that destroyed whatever was left after that fiery hail fell, that completely destroyed Egypt's food supply. Darkness. Ra was the Egyptian sun god, the giver of light. God sent 3 days of darkness so thick that none of the Egyptians moved for 3 days. Humiliated him. And then in Egyptian mythology, anytime one of the gods had a child, the firstborn of every one of the gods is killed in their mythology. In the 10th plague, God acts like an Egyptian god, killing the firstborn, including Pharaoh's firstborn, who considered himself to be a god. Now, the reason the first firstborn of humans and animals were killed without making any difference between them was because the Egyptians also believed that the firstborn of the animals had a divine character, like the bulls of Apis and the cows of Hathor. God wanted the Egyptians and the Israelites to both know that He was judging all them gods of Egypt. Now, there's something interesting about this sacrifice of the Passover lambs that I had never heard of. I never realized. But think about it for a minute, it makes sense. With the 10th plague, every household of Israel is told to sacrifice a lamb. By the way, the Egyptians also worship sheep. The sheep god Khnum was one of the main gods of Egypt and one of the oldest. Khnum's temple was on the island of Elephantine that they call Aswan now. He was supposed to protect the Nile too. Anyway, Moses tells all the Israelites to slaughter a lamb and put the blood on the door of their house to protect them from the angel of death by marking the door of their house with the blood of the lamb. Where'd they get all them sheep? They wiped out the Egyptians' sheep supply. That was the rest of their food. Anyway, let me give you some of these scientific explanations for them plagues. And most of these, let me just go ahead. The plagues of Egypt, you got to realize they're pretty impressive. God done a fine job. It's one of the most impressive of God's miracles in the whole Bible. They showcase just how incredible His power really is and are what finally pushes that proud old Pharaoh to let them Egyptians leave Egypt and get out of slavery. They also don't make sense. If you leave out divine intervention, they're hard to explain. So that don't stop science from trying. So what does science actually say about all these plagues? The Nile in the blood. The first plague, of course, remember, was the Nile turned red like blood. The water turned to blood and killed all the fish and made the land stink. And by the way, it already stunk, but that's another story. They used two scientific explanations to try to explain it. High rainfall in the area washed red clay down from Ethiopia that killed all the fish and made the Nile stink and turned it to poison. Okay. A sudden bloom of the same algae that causes the red tide. That happened. Okay. The second plague was frogs. Now, think about it a minute. If the Nile was poisoned by red clay from Ethiopia or from the red tide algae, the frogs would be trying to get away from the water and they'd just come boiling up out of that Nile River. Now, there might really have been a huge number of frogs, or if any of y'all have ever seen a couple of cockroaches or a spider on the floor of the kitchen, the house is infested. You know, it could have been some of that too. They might have been overestimating how many there was, but nevertheless, they thought they was infested, whether they was or not. Bugs. The third plague was a plague of lice, fleas, and gnats. Now, when all them frogs got run out of the water, those frogs that live in the Nile can't live long out of water. They dry out. Anyway, when the frogs started dying off, the number of bugs that ate frogs would have exploded. There would have been bugs everywhere. Then comes the fourth plague, flies. All them dead frogs turned into a feast for maggots and flies that carried the bacteria that causes cattle diseases and boils. Okay, the fifth plague, the plague of this sick cattle, was caused by diseases carried by the bugs out of the third and fourth plagues. Now scientists, they even figured out which disease it was. They said it was rinderpest, a deadly virus that kills whole populations of cattle all throughout African history. And it could also have been caused by them cattle drinking that poisoned water out of the Nile. And the reason the Israelites' cattle didn't get sick is because they kept them separate from the Egyptian cattle in Goshen, where the water was not turned into blood. Okay, number 6, festering boils and sores. Think about this for a minute. If you had to live with poisoned water, sick and dying cattle, piles and piles of rotten frogs laying everywhere, no food, all your cattle and your crops have done died off, and then swarms of flies and gnats and stuff carrying all kinds of diseases. The humans caught the diseases from the cattle, and the few that didn't catch the diseases, from the flies, the mosquitoes, and other insects swarm in Egypt, they didn't have nothing to eat. Okay, some scientists think the diseases were a lot more extreme than you can imagine. There's so many living with unbelievable filth, nastiness, and decay that the boils was probably smallpox or the black lumps caused by the bubonic plague. By the way, a lot of the mummies they found in Egypt from that period of time were covered with smallpox scars. Now here comes the good one. The 7th plague was hail mixed with fire. Somebody try to explain that to me. Fire does not come from the sky in a hailstorm, normally. Then they found something. Anybody ever heard of Santorini? It's an island in Greece. It's a volcanic island. And guess when it erupted? You'll never guess when it erupted. That's exactly right. Exactly the same time. The ash from that volcano mixed with a natural, normal, everyday thunderstorm to create massive balls of muddy hail. Now, if you've ever seen the picture or a movie of a volcano erupting, that dust and ash and stuff is just full of lightning. Now, that would have made it look like the sky was on fire. The ash would have increased the amount of lightning in the storm, because volcanic ash creates static electricity when it rubs against itself. All right, now, the flaming hail. The hot pumice stone that gets thrown out of a volcano is so light and airy that if the wind is blowing, it'll actually float on the wind. So it could have been mistaken for hail, but instead of ice, it was lava that was still red hot when it hit the ground. Okay, that's what the scientists say. The locust. The 8th plague was the plague of more locusts than anyone had ever seen before. Okay, there's 2 explanations the scientists give. Explanation number 1, locusts lay their eggs in the ground. And all that hail and the mud and stuff from that horrible rainstorm stirred them up, and they all come up. The frogs that normally ate locusts, they was laying in the yard rotting. Okay, the crops were already damaged, and it wouldn't take very many more locusts to eat up everything that was left. All right. Explanation number 2. That volcanic eruption on Santorini that happened at exactly the right time. caused the fiery hail could have dropped ash where the locusts normally live and drove them down into Egypt. So that's what the scientists got to say. Darkness, if you've got a volcano erupting in Memphis, Saudi and Sell Creek's going to be dark. You know? That's what they said. The ash cloud from the Santorini volcano blocked out the sun for 3 days. It took that long for it to get rid. Okay. The death of the firstborn. Think about this for a minute. It looks like that's one of the most miraculous. Looks like the finger of God coming down and picking out who he's going to kill. The firstborn of every house. The Egyptians done it to themselves. Germs can't tell the difference between the firstborn and later kids. They can't tell the difference. The germ's a germ. It's got more to do with the way the Egyptians lived than some kind of miraculous germ, okay? In Egypt, firstborn kids, especially firstborn sons, were the most important members of the family. They inherit more than all the other kids put together and carry on the family line. And when times are hard, firstborn kids are taken care of first, and anything that's left over is given to their brothers and sisters. Now, they was given more to eat. They're given a double portion of food during the plagues, and a family's trying to keep them healthy. Here's the problem. All them swarms of insects that had been stirred up by all them dead frogs and stuff, they got into their grain storage places, and bug droppings. There's a toxic mold that grows in bug poo that contaminated the top layer of the grain. Now, since the Egyptian firstborn sons ate double portion, they got the biggest helping of them poisons, and that's exactly right. And their younger brothers and sisters lived. So, science tries to find an explanation for everything, and it don't matter whether you accept or reject the scientific explanations for these plagues. Some people get offended. They think, well, you're trying to dismiss God's miracles. No, no. Even if all these scientific explanations are dead on, even if they're all true, that don't make those plagues any less miraculous. All it means is the miracle was in God's perfect timing. That's all it is. The Israelites. Now then, imagine being an Israelite for just a minute and seeing all this stuff going on. And trying, wow, God is just whooping their booty for us. They come out of Egypt believing in God. They passed through the Red Sea on dry land, and then turned around and watched that sea wipe out Pharaoh's whole army. And then, you've seen all this going on, right? And then, they get to the mountain of God. They come there so God could give them His laws. Now, these folks that lived in Egypt and Israel and all around in that area, they're real religious, superstitious. You know, there's a fine line between religion and superstition, you know. They worshiped a whole lot of gods. And, of course, them 10 plagues that God brought down on their heads was judgment against the gods they worshiped to show them that the one true God was more powerful than all of them. By the way, even Moses' father-in-law, who was a priest of Midian and a worshiper of the true God, he was affected by all the idols of these people around him. And when Moses and the people arrived at Mount Sinai, and Jethro, Moses' daddy-in-law, heard about all of God's works, he replied in Exodus 18, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them." Now, when God started giving his law to these Jews, he started out telling Moses in Exodus 20 verse 2, "I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." Sounded pretty clear to me.
Yeah.
I didn't have no trouble understanding that. Well, Moses went on up on the mountain to get God's laws. While he is gone, he's gone about 40 days. Wasn't really 40 days, you know. Hey. While he is gone, these same people that had seen all them plagues, been run across the Red Sea on dry ground, the whole nine, just watched Pharaoh's army get destroyed. These same people, a few days later, they're starting to get antsy and impatient. Moses was on the mountain 40 days, according to Exodus 24:18, and the people started thinking that he died or run off. He's left us. So they asked Aaron to make them some gods to follow, because they was used to having little statues of their gods, you know, that they could set on the mantle to worship, you know. So Aaron melted down their earrings and molded them into a golden calf. Now, what's the difference between that and what a lot of them Catholics do? They'll put a plastic Jesus on the dashboard of their car. I don't see a lot of difference. But anyway, that's another story. Aaron was in a hard spot there. He's been in a rock and hard place. He was trying to do what some of today's religious leaders do. He was trying to combine pagan religions that they is used to with worshiping the one true God. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Okay. There's something in here that most people just sort of pass over without saying much about it, okay? Orgies. Aaron told them that the golden calf was the God that delivered them from Egypt, and the people offered sacrifices and then engaged in a big feast, and then they had some pagan rituals, including orgies.
Okay.
Exodus 32, verse 6. "And they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." And then in Exodus 32:25, when Moses come down the hill, "And when Moses saw that the people were naked," for Aaron had made them naked under their shame among their enemies. Why did Aaron do all that, by the way? Let's go back to making the golden calf and letting this thing get out of hand like that. Why did he do that? Bible don't say.
No.
But we can put two and two together and get a pretty good idea. First, everybody there, the whole Israelite camp, was very familiar with idol worship, and they knew how it was done. They had little statues, and you worshiped and blah blah. They would be inclined to follow that in the absence of a clear command not to, because Moses hadn't come down with that "I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me" command yet. He hadn't come back off the mountain with that. So the people hadn't received the command against worshiping idols, and the Israelites was used to combining their beliefs with the people around them, and that bothered them, by the way, all through the kingdom years. That kept on bothering. And Aaron, bless his heart, he had this unruly mob of Jews that demanded that he make them a god. The solution of, well, I'll just make a little golden idol and call it by God's name, that made good sense to him. That's what he's used to doing. Then in Exodus 32:24, Aaron, when Moses come down and started chewing on that hind end, Aaron give him a lame excuse. In Exodus 32:24, Moses asked him, "How come you done that?" And Aaron said, "I just threw their gold earrings in the fire and it just came out like that by itself." He said that. Exodus 32:24. I laughed out anyway. He's just trying to dodge the blame. According to Exodus 32 verse 4, it says he actually carved it very carefully with an engraving tool. He made that thing. Well, and what they say, they call it a golden calf in the King James Version. The actual, he made a cow. He made a bull is what he made. And the bull, the Egyptians called it Apis. That was one of their main gods. But some people say that Aaron's bull was Apis, one of the gods of Egypt, but that don't make sense, because Aaron, when he called for that feast and that orgy and all that stuff, he said the golden bull was the Lord Yahweh, and that he was the God that brought them out of Egypt. Now, a bull is a symbol of strength and fertility, and the Jews was already used to the bull god of Egypt, and bulls were also sacrificial animals, so making a golden bull, it just made sense. It was a natural connection. Aaron's bull was supposed to be a mixture of God that delivered their people, combined with the way they was used to worshiping that was borrowed from the people around them. Why in the world am I spending all this time on all this stuff? There's a connection to us. There's a connection. You put yourself in the place of those Israelites. They thought that they could, well, let me just read it to you. It's easy for us as Christians to kick back and say, I ain't got to do nothing because Jesus done everything for me. I ain't got to do nothing. I can sin all I want and then tell God I'm sorry and everything will be fine. The Israelites thought they could do as they pleased because Abraham was their ancestor. John the Baptist lined them up in Matthew chapter 3 when he saw a bunch of Pharisees and Sadducees coming to get his baptism. Okay? Let me read it to you. This is connecting us with these people of Israel here. Matthew 3 verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits meet for repentance, and think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. And now also the axe is laid under the root of the trees. Therefore every tree which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. I indeed baptize you with water unto repentance, but he that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose shoes I am not worthy to bear. He shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost and with fire. I believe Jesus. That means everything's fine. Is it? Reasonable explanations. Reasonable explanations for why Aaron and the Jews began to worship that golden calf. They're reasonable. But they don't excuse the sin. God's held the people accountable for their corruption in Exodus 32 verses 7 through 10 and was ready to kill every one of them. Did y'all know that? As soon as Moses come down and saw them people acting the way they was acting, God come down and, well, let me just read it. God was ready to destroy them for their sin, and the only thing that stopped God from destroying them was Moses begging him not to. Moses, after he talked God out of destroying everybody, and by the way, that's another thing. God can be convinced by earnest prayer. But anyway, Moses called for everybody who was on the Lord's side to come stand with him. That wasn't very popular. The Levites were the only ones that stood with him. All the other tribes of Israel stayed over there naked partying. So the Levites, he commanded the Levites to go through the camp and kill everybody who persisted in their idolatry. There was 3,000 men killed that day. These are the same people that had been promised the promised land. They were promised that if they followed Moses and he led them through all this stuff, they would get to go into the promised land and live in a large land flowing with milk and honey. Does that sound familiar? The next day, after he killed them 3,000 men, Moses went up and confessed the people's sins to God, asking him for forgiveness. And God said, okay, I'll forgive them. No, he didn't. God declared that the guilty ones would yet pay with their own death and be blotted out of his book. You're not supposed to say stuff like this. This is a Baptist church. Let me read it again. God declared the guilty ones would yet pay with their own death and be blotted out of his book. These were the same ones, same people, who right at the edge of going into the promised land would deny God's promises and be sent back into the wilderness for 40 years to die for their sins, and their children would be the ones to receive God's blessings. We might try to justify our actions with reason and logic. But if we're violating God's clear commands, we are sinning against him, and he will hold us accountable for those sins. Now, the biggest problem, the only problem that we've got is an unbelieving heart. In Hebrews starting with 3 verse 7, we are warned to learn the lesson that Israel was taught when she rebelled in the wilderness. In Hebrews 3 verse 7, wherefore, as the Holy Ghost saith, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation, in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years, wherefore I was grieved with that generation and said, they do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swear in my wrath that they shall not enter into my rest. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. While it is said, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation. Now, back to the Israelites, obeying God's not what got them saved out of Israel. That's not what got them saved. They didn't do anything except pray. Obeying God is not what got them saved. But their disobedience kept them out of the promised land. Hebrews 3:18, we read this. And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believe not. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. That's how it's going to be with the church if the church shares that same heart of unbelief. The next verse, Hebrews 3:19. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. In Matthew 7:16, this is what happened. Matthew 7:16, I'm about to. Matthew 7:16, you shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them. Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Thank you all. I'll see you next week.